She slammed the plate down so hard the fork bounced off the table and clattered onto the dirt floor. "I wouldn't feed this to my pigs," Evelyn Mercer said, loud enough for every man in that cookhouse to hear. She didn't even look at Maeve. She looked at the Cowboys, 40 of them, dusty and tired and hungry. And she smiled the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile at all. "Boys, I suggest you take your supper outside and let the dogs have it." 40 men, 40 plates. And not a single one of them reached for his fork. Maeve Callahan stood at the stove with a wooden spoon in her hand and said nothing. Her face didn't crack. But something behind her eyes did. She had $2.40 left in the world. She had nowhere to go back to. And she had just watched a woman she'd never wronged destroy her only chance at survival in under 30 seconds. If that had been you standing at that stove, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, if you've ever had to start over with nothing and no one in your corner, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The summer of 1889 arrived in Iron Ridge County. The way bad news always does, without warning and with no intention of leaving. The land out there didn't care about your problems. It baked everything flat and pale under a sun that seemed personally offended by the idea of shade. The grass along the road into the main property had gone yellow and brittle by mid-June, and by the time Maeve Callahan walked that road on a Tuesday morning in July, the dust her boots kicked up hung in the air long after she'd passed, like the land was marking her arrival with reluctance. She was 27 years old, and she looked older. Not in a sad way, exactly. More in the way of someone who had been through weather that didn't show up on any map. Her hair was dark and pinned back with 2 spare pins that didn't quite match. Her dress was clean but worn through at both elbows, and she carried a carpet bag that had seen better decades. Inside it, 2 changes of clothes, a tin of her mother's recipe cards wrapped in an old dish towel, a photograph she no longer looked at, and $2.40 in mixed coin. That was everything. That was the whole sum of Maeve Callahan's life in the summer of 1889. She hadn't planned on ending up here. Nobody plans on ending up at someone else's ranch carrying their whole world in a bag that weighs less than a good Sunday roast. But the bakery in Tulsa was gone. Fire took it in March, fast and thorough and absolute. And with it went the last thing her husband Daniel had built with his hands before his heart gave out the previous winter. She'd spent 4 months trying to hold what remained together. She'd sold the equipment. She'd paid off what she could. She'd worn out her welcome with every relative who'd had any welcome to offer. Iron Ridge Ranch was 40 miles from anything that called itself a town. It employed between 38 and 42 cowboys depending on the season, ran several thousand head of cattle, and according to the woman at the dry goods store in Hallett who'd mentioned the job opening, hadn't had a decent cook since the last one quit in April after a dispute involving a cast iron pan and a man named Dooley, who nobody seemed to like much. Maeve had gotten the name Gideon Ashcroft from that same woman. She'd walked to the post office and written a letter that same afternoon, offering her services as ranch cook on a trial basis. She'd listed what she could do with flour, butter, dried beans, and whatever game came through the kitchen door, and she had not exaggerated because she'd never found exaggerating to be worth the trouble it caused later. 3 weeks after she sent that letter, she received 4 lines back in a handwriting that leaned hard to the right as if the wind had gotten into it. Mrs. Callahan, 1-week trial, meals for 40 men, 3 times daily. You provide your own supplies from ranch stores with the foreman's approval. If the crew is satisfied at week's end, we discuss terms. Report Monday. G. Ashcroft. She'd read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it in the tin with the recipe cards. Monday came. She reported. The first person she met at Iron Ridge was not Gideon Ashcroft. It was his foreman, a lean, sun-creased man named Walt Briggs, who looked like he'd been made out of old rope and squinting. He met her at the gate with the particular expression of a man who'd been told to expect something and didn't trust what he'd been told. "You're the cook," he said. It wasn't a question exactly, more like an accusation he was willing to temporarily suspend. "Maeve Callahan," she said, and held out her hand. He shook it, briefly, the way men out there shook hands with women they weren't sure what to make of, like the gesture was borrowed from a different situation entirely. He walked her to the cookhouse without saying much, which she appreciated. The cookhouse was a long, low building set apart from the main bunkhouse by about 40 yards. Inside, a long plank table with benches on both sides, a large iron stove, a pantry that was moderately stocked, a small back room with a cot and a wash basin that was apparently hers, and a woodpile outside that needed splitting. Crew eats at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening, Walt said. He was looking at the pantry as he spoke, not at her, cataloging whatever he was cataloging. They work hard and they're hungry. They're not polite. If something isn't right, they'll say so and they won't say it gently. I expect that, Maeve said. He looked at her then, briefly. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but the faint possibility of it. Mr. Ashcroft won't be back until Thursday, he said. He's in Wichita for a contract meeting. I understand. You need anything before tonight's supper? You come find me. He left. She stood in the middle of that cookhouse, set her carpet bag down on the cot, and took a slow, steady breath. She had until 6 o'clock. It was just past 9 in the morning. She tied on her apron, rolled up her sleeves, and went to look at what she had to work with. The pantry wasn't bad. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, canned tomatoes, dried apples, coffee, sugar, lard. Someone had left a half-used jar of molasses and a tin of baking powder with the lid not quite sealed all the way, which she made note of. There was a side of beef hanging in the back that was recent enough to be good. She could work with this. She had worked with less. What she did not account for was Evelyn Mercer. Evelyn arrived at the cookhouse at 4:30 that afternoon. Maeve heard her before she saw her. Heels on the wooden step, a specific kind of knock that wasn't really asking permission so much as announcing a verdict. The door opened and a woman came in who looked about 45, wore good clothes for the territory, and had the kind of face that had probably been handsome once and had since decided to express that fact through judgment of others. You must be the trial cook, Evelyn said. She looked around the cookhouse the way you look at a room you already know you're going to criticize, taking inventory before the words are even fully formed. Maeve Callahan, Maeve said. She was standing at the stove and didn't turn around entirely because the beans needed watching. Evelyn Mercer. My sister was Margaret Ashcroft, Gideon's wife. A pause that was doing a lot of work. She passed 2 years ago. I've been helping manage the household affairs since. Maeve turned then, because it seemed right to look the woman in the face. I'm sorry for your loss. Evelyn received this the way someone receives a gift they already decided they don't want. Yes. Well, I want you to know that I run a very particular household here. The children eat at 7. Clara is 8 and she has specific preferences. You'll accommodate them. Of course, Maeve said. What does she prefer? Something flickered across Evelyn's expression. Slight surprise, quickly recovered. She doesn't eat tomatoes, or beans with the skin on, or anything spiced too strongly. I can work with that. Evelyn looked at the stove, then at the table, then at Maeve, who had gone back to the beans. I also want to be clear, Evelyn said, that the ranch supply budget is very tight this season. I've spoken with Walt about limiting unnecessary expenditures. If you need anything beyond what's already in the pantry, you'll need to request it from me directly. This was new. This was not what the letter from Gideon Ashcroft had said. The letter had said she'd work with the foreman's approval, not with Evelyn Mercer's approval. Maeve kept her voice even. I was told I'd coordinate with the foreman on supplies. Walt is very busy, Evelyn said. I've offered to take that responsibility on. The two women looked at each other for a long moment across that cookhouse. Maeve nodded slowly. Not agreeing exactly, just acknowledging that she'd understood what had just been said and what hadn't been said. Evelyn left. Her heels went back down the step. Maeve stood for a moment with a wooden spoon in her hand, staring at nothing in particular, thinking. Then she turned back to the stove and kept cooking. She made beef stew. Slow, thick, the kind that coats the spoon and the kind of thing you want at the end of a hard day. She made cornbread in a cast iron pan, 2 batches, which she'd timed carefully so both came out hot. She made coffee strong enough to be worth drinking. She sliced the bread she'd put together first thing that morning, which had risen properly and smelled right. By 5:30, she had 40 plates ready. The cookhouse smelled like something lived in it for the first time in a long while. The men came in at 6. They came in the way 40 working cowboys come in anywhere, loud, dusty, already talking about 4 separate conversations at once, pulling off hats, scraping boots. They filled the benches without any ceremony, and Maeve began to serve. She was 3 plates in when it started. Not with the men, with Evelyn, who came back. She walked in while Maeve was serving, came directly to the table, lifted the nearest bowl of stew, and held it up with 2 fingers like she was examining evidence of a crime. She sniffed it, set it down, looked at the men. "Boys," she said, and her voice carried the full length of that table. "I'm not sure what we're supposed to call this, but I wouldn't serve it to the dogs out back." The table went quiet. Not immediately. Noise doesn't stop all at once. But it fell away, joke by joke, word by word, until there were 40 men sitting in silence, staring at their supper. Then one of them, a big man near the end of the table, red-faced, went by the name of Holt, pushed his bowl 2 inches forward. It was such a small gesture, 2 inches, but it was like the first rock that starts a slide. Another man followed, then another. Then Evelyn picked up a plate of cornbread, and she didn't say anything. She just walked to the door and set it on the step outside, and the meaning of that was perfectly clear to every man in that room. Maeve stood at the stove. She was holding the ladle. She watched it happen, bowl by bowl, plate by plate. Every man at that table, without a word of his own, followed what Evelyn Mercer had started. The ones near the end who hadn't even taken a bite yet just slid their food away from themselves and looked somewhere else, not quite willing to eat, but not willing to be the only man who did either. 40 men. 40 plates of food she had spent 8 hours preparing. Not one of them touched it. When the last man had filed out, Evelyn looked at Maeve across the room. She had the expression of someone who has just completed a task they'd planned carefully and found the result satisfying. "There's always the morning train out of Hallett," she said, and then she left. The cookhouse was very quiet. Maeve set the ladle down on the side of the stove. She looked at 40 untouched plates of food. She looked at the cornbread on the step outside, which one of the dogs had already found and was working on. She reached into her apron pocket and felt the 2 coins there, all that was left after the food she'd bought herself on the road. $2.40 total, somewhere in her bag. She had nowhere to sleep tonight except that cot in the back room. She had nowhere to go in the morning except down that road. She had no one to call and no letter to write that would solve anything by sunrise. She stood in the middle of the cookhouse for a long time, long enough that the sun finished going down and the lamp became the only light in the room. Then she bent down, opened the stove grate, and began to build the fire back up. She wasn't leaving, not tonight, not without trying something else first. She had noticed, in the afternoon when she'd gone out to pull wood, that behind the storage shed, half hidden by the shed's shadow and a tangle of old fence posts, there was an orchard. Peach trees. 12 of them, maybe 14. Old and gnarly looking, the kind that had been forgotten rather than abandoned. Half the fruit on the ground already, going soft in the heat. But the fruit still on the branches, she'd looked close, she'd made herself look close, was ripe. More than ripe. It was at that perfect edge where it would be either perfect or gone within 48 hours. She took the lantern. She took every large bowl she could find in the pantry. She went out to that orchard in the dark. She filled every bowl, both hands, over and over, until her arms ached and the lantern burned hot near her face. She carried them back in 2 loads, set them on the table, and looked at what she had. Then she went to the pantry and she started to count. Flour, lard, sugar, butter. Not much, but some. Cinnamon, which she'd found in a tin in the back she wasn't sure anyone knew about. Salt. The baking powder with the loose lid, which she tapped closed with the heel of her hand. She had enough for pies. Not one pie, several pies. She thought about her mother's kitchen in Tennessee, 30 degrees cooler and 40 years ago in her memory, and the particular way her mother had pressed the crust edge with 3 fingers instead of a fork. Because a fork left marks that were too regular, her mother said, and regular things were boring. She started with the crust. She worked with her hands, the way she'd always worked, and the dough came together the way it always did when she took her time. Not perfectly, because dough is never perfect, but right. She rolled and filled and crimped and set them in the oven, one after another, and between pies she peeled and sliced more peaches, and the juice ran down her wrists, and her apron was ruined by midnight, and she did not care at all. The first pie came out at 11 o'clock. She set it on the table to cool and started the next. By 2 in the morning, she had 7. By 4, she had 9. She was starting the 10th when she heard it, a sound outside. Boots on the step. She turned and the door was open, and standing in it was the big man from the end of the table. Holt. He was in his long underwear and his boots, and he was holding his hat in his hand, even though there was no reason to hold his hat at 4 in the morning in front of a cook. He was looking at the pies on the table, and he had an expression on his face that was difficult to read and then was not difficult to read at all. "Lord Almighty," he said very quietly. "You can have a slice when they're cool," Maeve said. She turned back to her crust. He didn't leave. After a moment she heard him sit down on the bench, and she heard him not say anything for a while. And then she heard the sound of the bunkhouse door and more boots. And when she looked over her shoulder, there were 4 more men in the doorway. Then 6. Then a dozen. By the time the sun came up, there were 27 men sitting at that table, most of them not saying much, watching the last 2 pies come out of the oven. Maeve cut the first pie and served the man closest to her, which happened to be Holt. He took a bite and was quiet for a moment that seemed longer than it was. Then he said, "Ma'am, I owe you an apology, and I'm going to give it to you straight." She looked at him. "I didn't touch my supper last night because Mrs. Mercer is—" He stopped, looked at his plate. "She's got a way of making a man feel stupid for not agreeing with her is what I'm saying, and I'm not proud of that. I should have eaten my supper and not cared what she thought." "You should have," Maeve said, without anger. "Just fact." "Yes, ma'am." He looked up at her then, and his face was red and genuine. "That was a wrong thing we did. The whole table." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "There's pie for all of you." That was all she said. And somehow, that was enough. By the time the last pie was cut and the plates were scraped clean, the sun had fully cleared the horizon, and the cookhouse smelled like something between a bakery and a second chance. Maeve hadn't slept. Her back told her about it in specific and detailed terms every time she turned from the stove. Her hands were sticky with dried peach juice, and there was a burn on her left wrist from where she'd caught the edge of the oven rack around 2 in the morning, a thin red line she'd wrapped with a strip of dish towel and promptly ignored. She was running on coffee, and whatever that particular kind of stubborn is, that doesn't have a good name, but most people recognize when they feel it. The men ate quietly. That was the thing she noticed most. 40 cowboys who'd come in the night before like a storm coming through a gap in the hills were now sitting at that same table with their hats in their laps, cutting pie with the careful focus of men who understood, without anyone saying so, that something needed to be undone, and this was the only tool available to them. Holt had gotten up twice to refill his own coffee without being asked, which she appreciated. He'd also quietly moved the stack of dirty bowls from last night's untouched supper to the side of the room without making a thing of it, just picked them up and stacked them against the wall out of the way, which was its own kind of apology. A younger man, couldn't have been more than 20, with ears that were slightly too large for his current head and a sunburn across his nose that looked recent and painful, raised his hand from the middle of the bench like he was in a schoolroom. "Ma'am?" She looked at him. "I want you to know I was going to eat last night," he said. "I had my spoon ready and everything, but then Holt pushed his bowl and I didn't know what—" He stopped. "I'm Pete. I'm sorry." "You're young," Maeve said. It wasn't an excuse exactly, more like a fact that explained other facts. "Yes, ma'am. Still." He looked at his empty plate. "Is there any more pie?" There wasn't. She'd made 11, and 11 were gone, and she was honestly a little surprised she was still standing upright, but she said, "No, but there'll be breakfast in an hour if you men want to earn it by splitting that woodpile out back." There was a pause. Then Holt stood up, looked down the table, and said, "You heard her." 8 men followed him outside. She heard the first crack of the axe before she'd even turned back to the stove. Walt Briggs came in at 7. He came in the way he did most things, quietly, taking in the room before committing to any particular reaction. He looked at the empty pie tins on the table. He looked at Maeve at the stove, who was working on eggs and salt pork and a second pot of coffee. He looked at the small burn on her wrist she'd wrapped with the dish towel. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Long night." "Productive," she said. He sat down at the far end of the table, away from the remaining men, and waited until she brought him a plate. He ate a few bites and then set his fork down in a way that meant he had something to say that wasn't about food. Mrs. Mercer came to see me this morning, he said. Maeve kept her back to him, stirring. She said last night's supper was inedible and that she recommended the trial be ended. Did she? I told her the trial was Mr. Ashcroft's arrangement and I wasn't in a position to end it without his word. A pause. She didn't like that. I expect not. Walt picked his fork back up. You're not going to ask me what I think of the food. You're eating it, Maeve said. I don't need to ask. He made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, arrested before it fully formed. He ate the rest of his plate and left without saying much else, but he paused at the door and said, without turning around, that woodpile needed doing for 2 weeks. Those men out there doing it now? That's not nothing. She heard him go. She stood at the stove and felt something loosen slightly in her chest, some knot she'd been carrying since the previous evening that hadn't fully let go until right then. But she knew better than to mistake a loosened knot for one that was untied. Evelyn Mercer did not appear at breakfast. She appeared instead at 11 o'clock in the morning when Maeve was in the middle of planning the noon meal and taking stock of what she'd used the night before. She came in without knocking. She never knocked. Maeve was already understanding. And she set a piece of paper on the table with a flat, decisive sound. Supply request, Evelyn said. For the household accounts. Clara needs... Mrs. Mercer, Maeve said, not unkindly. I'm in the middle of counting flour. Evelyn stopped. The interruption clearly surprised her. Most people, Maeve guessed, didn't interrupt Evelyn Mercer mid-sentence. I can look at the household supply request this afternoon, Maeve said, after the noon meal. I wasn't finished speaking. I know. But I have 40 men who need to eat in an hour, and I'm short on time. Maeve looked up from the flour sack. I'll come find you at 2 o'clock. We can go through it together. The two women looked at each other. Evelyn's jaw tightened just slightly at the hinge, a small tell that Maeve filed away. See that you do, Evelyn said, and left the paper on the table and walked out. Maeve looked at the paper. It was a supply request, as claimed. Flour, sugar, 2 yards of cotton cloth for mending, lamp oil. Reasonable things. Nothing on it that should have required a dramatic entrance, which meant the supply request wasn't really the point. She folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went back to counting flour. The noon meal went cleanly. Beans that had been soaking since early morning, cornbread that she'd gotten the proportions right on this time. She'd been a little heavy-handed with the salt the night before. She'd known it while she was doing it, and done it anyway out of tiredness, which was the kind of mistake you make when you're managing too many things at once. And the rest of the salt pork stretched with dried apples in a way that wasn't fancy but was filling and tasted like someone had put thought into it. The men ate. All of them. 3 of the ones who'd been most pointedly avoiding her eye that morning made small, gruff sounds of acknowledgement when they finished, which she understood to mean they'd found it acceptable. Cowboys out there didn't say this is good the way other people might. They said it through the particular quality of their silence. Pete, the young one with the ears, said, Ma'am, this is real good, which made 2 of the older men look at him sideways, but nobody contradicted him. She went to find Evelyn at 2 o'clock, as she'd said she would. Evelyn was in the main house, in a sitting room that had the atmosphere of a room where someone had rearranged things enough times that nothing quite belonged anywhere anymore. There were 2 chairs and a small table and a window that looked out toward the bunkhouse, and Evelyn was sitting in the better chair when Maeve came in, which Maeve thought was probably not accidental. She sat in the other one without being invited and spread the supply list on the table between them. They went through it item by item, and it was perfectly civil. It was so perfectly civil that by the end of it, Maeve felt more unsettled than she had when she came in. Civil in that particular way wasn't peace. It was management. Evelyn was managing her and doing it well, and the fact that she was doing it well meant she'd had practice. I'll need to go through the pantry stores again, Maeve said at the end. I used more last night than I'd planned. Because you baked 11 pies at 2 in the morning, Evelyn said. Not loud. Not mean, exactly. Just precise. I did, Maeve said. That seems like poor management of resources. It seemed like the right thing to do at the time. Evelyn looked at her. The right thing for whom? Those men ate their midnight snack and now they think they have a 5-star restaurant on the property. You've set an expectation you can't maintain. I wasn't trying to set an expectation, Maeve said. I was trying to fix what had gone wrong. What had gone wrong, Evelyn said slowly, was that the food was not up to standard. Maeve kept her voice level. The The food was turned away before a single man tasted it. The room got quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A recalibration, fast and subtle. She was reassessing, Maeve understood, figuring out whether this woman across from her was going to be easier or harder than she'd initially measured. The men of this ranch, Evelyn said finally, have particular standards. My sister maintained them for 12 years. I've been maintaining them for 2. A week's trial is a trial. It isn't a contract. And if the cook doesn't fit the culture of this ranch, the kindest thing is to say so plainly. Maeve folded her hands in her lap. I appreciate plain speech, she said. So I'll offer some. I'm not leaving before the week is up. I gave my word to Mr. Ashcroft and I'll hold to it. If at the end of that week he decides I'm not the right fit, I'll go without argument. But that's his decision to make, not yours or mine. The silence this time lasted longer. Then Evelyn stood up, smoothed her skirt, and said, We'll see what Gideon thinks when he returns. She said it the way someone says something they believe is the last word on a subject. Maeve said, Yes, we will, and meant it differently. She walked back to the cookhouse and let herself in and stood for a moment with her hand on the doorframe, breathing. Then she started on supper. Gideon Ashcroft came back Thursday afternoon, 2 days earlier than expected. Maeve heard about it from Pete, who appeared at the cookhouse door around 3 with the slightly breathless energy of someone delivering news they're glad to deliver. Mr. Ashcroft's back, Pete said. His meeting in Wichita finished early. He's talking to Walt now. Thank you, Pete. He looks tired, Pete offered, like this was additional relevant data. Most people do after a long ride, Maeve said. Do you want something, or did you just come to tell me that? He grinned, that young, uncomplicated grin that boys have before the world gets its hands on them properly. Both, I guess. She gave him a biscuit from the batch she'd made that morning, and he left satisfied. She had a decision to make. She could wait for Gideon Ashcroft to come to her, which he would presumably do at some point before supper. Or she could go find him herself, which meant taking the initiative and risking being seen as presumptuous, but also meant controlling the order in which he received information. Evelyn had already been in the main house when Ashcroft arrived. That much Pete had mentioned without knowing it mattered. Maeve untied her apron, hung it on the hook by the stove, straightened her dress as well as it could be straightened, and walked across the yard to the main house. She knocked, properly, and waited. A small girl opened the door, 8 years old maybe, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's narrower face. She was wearing a dress with a grass stain on the knee that someone had attempted to clean and not fully succeeded at, and she was holding a book with a finger keeping her place, which Maeve respected immediately. You must be Clara, Maeve said. Yes, Clara said. Are you the cook? I am. Is your father in? He's talking to Aunt Evelyn in the study. Clara paused. Aunt Evelyn talks a lot when Papa comes home. He gets this face. She demonstrated the face, a slight tightening around the eyes, and a particular set of the jaw that was, Maeve thought, a very accurate impression for an 8-year-old to have perfected. I can wait, Maeve said. You can come in, Clara said, and stepped back from the door with the decisive hospitality of someone who believed it was her house as much as anyone's. Maeve came in. She stood in the front hallway and looked at the house. Not the furniture or the decorations, but the feel of it, which was a thing she'd learned to read the way other people read words. A house with a child in it, and no mother in it, had a specific kind of unfinished quality that wasn't about cleanliness or upkeep. Exactly. It was something else. A particular kind of missing. Clara sat down in the hallway on the bottom step of the stairs, crossed her ankles, opened her book, and began to read as if Maeve's presence was completely ordinary, which was its own form of welcome. Maeve waited. After about 10 minutes, a door opened down the hall, and Evelyn came out of it with the composed expression of someone who had just been winning an argument, or had been trying to, and wasn't sure yet which one. She stopped when she saw Maeve. Her expression did the recalibrating thing again. Mrs. Callahan, she said, what are you doing in the house? I let her in, Clara said from the stairs, without looking up from her book. Evelyn looked at Clara with the particular expression of an adult who cannot argue with a child without losing something important. Then she looked back at Maeve. Gideon is tired from his journey, she said. This isn't a good time. I won't take much of his time, Maeve said. Down the hall, the study door opened again, and a man came out of it. I was tall, taller than Maeve had imagined from the handwriting, with the kind of build that started out broad and had been worked lean over years of physical labor. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, and several days of beard on his jaw, and he moved like someone whose back hurt, but who had decided not to let it bother him too visibly. He stopped when he saw the hallway situation, took it in, his daughter on the stairs, Evelyn in the middle of the hall with her particular expression, and a woman he'd never met standing near the front door in a dress with flower on the cuff that she'd clearly just noticed and was ignoring. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. He said it like he'd been expecting her, which maybe he had. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said, "I'm sorry to come to the house uninvited. I wanted to introduce myself properly before you heard about the weak second hand." He looked at Evelyn briefly. Something passed between them that was old and complicated and none of Maeve's business. Then he looked back at her. "Come in," he said, and gestured toward the study. Evelyn took a step forward. "Gideon, I really think—" "Thank you, Evelyn," he said. Not harshly, but finally. Maeve followed him into the study, and he closed the door. It was a working room, papers on the desk, a ledger open to a page of numbers that looked like they were not making anyone happy, a calendar on the wall with several dates circled in different colors. He sat on the edge of the desk rather than behind it, which she noted, and he said, "Tell me what happened Monday night." She told him. She told him straight, the way she'd have wanted to be told straight, what she'd cooked, what happened when Evelyn came in, what the men did, and what she did afterward. She didn't editorialize. She didn't describe Evelyn as a villain or herself as a hero. She just described the sequence of events in the order they'd happened. He listened with his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor between them, and he didn't interrupt once. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. 11 pies, he said. 11 and a half. The last one I only half finished before I started serving. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. The men told Walt about the pies this morning. Walt told me when I rode in. He uncrossed his arms. He said Holt volunteered to help you with morning prep. Holt hasn't volunteered for anything that didn't involve cattle since 1884. He's been helpful, Maeve said. Gideon looked at her then, directly, the way people look at someone when they're deciding something. Mrs. Mercer told me the food Monday night was inedible. Did she tell you she announced that before any man at the table tasted it? He held her gaze. No, she left that part out. Silence. I'm not here to make trouble, Maeve said. I'm here because I need the work, and I'm good at the job. I will cook 3 meals a day, I will not waste supplies, and I will not be cruel to anyone in this household. That's what I can offer you. She paused. But I need to be able to do the job without someone deciding what gets served before I serve it. He nodded once, slowly. You've got till Sunday, he said. That's the end of the week we agreed on. We'll see where things stand. It wasn't the victory she'd wanted. It wasn't a defeat either. It was more like standing at a door that was neither open nor closed, which she supposed was the most honest kind of beginning. She went back to the cookhouse, and she made supper, and the men ate it, and nobody pushed their bowl away. What she hadn't anticipated was Clara. The girl appeared at the cookhouse door Friday morning at 6:15, still in her nightdress with a coat thrown over it, her hair not fully braided. She stood in the doorway and watched Maeve work for a long moment without saying anything. Did you want breakfast? Maeve asked. Not yet, Clara said. I wanted to see what you were doing. Making biscuits. Clara came in and sat on the stool near the door, not at the table, just at the edge of the room, like she hadn't fully committed to being there yet. She watched the whole process, the cutting of the fat into the flour, the folding, the shaping. Mama used to make biscuits, she said. Maeve kept working. Did she make them like this? I don't remember exactly, Clara said. Her voice was flat in that particular way children's voices get when they're discussing something they've had to practice being calm about. She died when I was 6. I know, Maeve said. I'm sorry about that. Aunt Evelyn makes them sometimes, but they're flat. She presses too hard. Maeve almost smiled. You're right that you shouldn't press too hard. Can I try? She handed the girl a piece of dough. Clara shaped it with the intense, slightly too forceful focus of an 8-year-old who was determined to do something correctly, and the resulting biscuit was lopsided in a way that would probably come out just fine. Put it with the others, Maeve said. Clara placed it on the pan with great care. When the biscuits came out 20 minutes later and Maeve split the lopsided one open and put a little butter on it and handed it to Clara, the girl took a bite and went very quiet for a moment in a way that wasn't about the food. It tastes like it should, Clara said finally. Maeve didn't ask her what she meant by that. She thought she understood. By Saturday, something had shifted in the ranch that Maeve wouldn't have known how to predict and couldn't fully explain if someone had asked her to. The men were different, not dramatically different. They were still loud, and they still tracked mud, and they still had arguments about things that probably didn't warrant arguments. But the quality of the cookhouse at mealtimes had changed. Men lingered after they'd eaten instead of filing out immediately. There were conversations that didn't have anything to do with cattle. Pete had started helping with dishes without being asked, which Holt teased him about in the mild way that meant he approved. The food had done some of it, yes, but Maeve knew that food alone doesn't change a room. What changes a room is when people start feeling like they belong in it. She was at the stove Saturday evening when Walt came in and told her that 2 riders from the Pemberton Ranch, 12 miles east, had come by asking if it was true that Iron Ridge had gotten a new cook. Walt had told them it was true, and they'd asked if she'd be at the cookhouse Sunday. Walt had not said yes or no because he hadn't known what to say. "What do you want me to say if they ask again?" Walt said. "Tell them Sunday dinner's at noon," Maeve said. "There'll be enough." Walt nodded. He was halfway to the door when he turned back. "Mrs. Mercer is going to have opinions about outside visitors." "Mrs. Mercer has opinions about most things," Maeve said. "Tell them noon." He left. She turned back to the stove and began planning Sunday's meal in her head with the methodical focus she brought to everything, calculating what she had and what she could do with it, and behind all of it was the awareness, quiet but present, that Sunday was also the last day of the trial week. She'd made it 6 days. She'd cooked 17 meals. She'd had exactly one conversation with Gideon Ashcroft that didn't go through Evelyn's interpretation of events. She'd gained a lopsided biscuit and a small girl's tentative company and the grudging respect of 40 men who had started something they were still figuring out how to finish apologizing for. She didn't know if that was enough. She genuinely didn't know. What she knew was that she had one more day, and she intended to make it count. Sunday morning, she was up at 4:30. Not because she had to be, she'd done her prep the night before, more than usual, but because she couldn't sleep. She lay on the cot in the back room listening to the dark and thinking about the sequence of everything. The fire in March, Daniel's face in the photograph she no longer looked at, the letter that leaned to the right in the wind, the 40 untouched plates, the orchard in the dark. She thought about what Evelyn had said. "You've set an expectation you can't maintain." And she thought about whether that was true and decided it wasn't. Not because the expectations weren't high, but because the problem with Evelyn's reasoning was that it assumed the goal was to be comfortable. Maeve wasn't interested in comfortable. She'd had comfortable for a few years in Tulsa and she'd been grateful for it, but it was gone now, and it wasn't coming back. And so the question was what you do with what's left. What's left is the next meal, the next day, the next thing you can do well. She got up at 4:30, and she lit the lamp and she started the fire. The peach orchard still had fruit on it. She'd checked yesterday, made herself go look. There were maybe enough for 9 pies if she was careful about it. Not 11. 9. She took the lantern and the bowls and she went back out to the orchard in the dark. And the morning was cool in a way that July mornings sometimes surprised you with. A brief window of bearable before the heat remembered itself. And the peaches came off the branches clean and ripe and heavy in her hands. By the time the sun came up, she had 9 pies in the oven, and the whole cookhouse smelled like something that people would remember for a long time, the kind of smell that lives in a place and stays in it long after the occasion that made it is over. At 8 o'clock, Clara appeared at the door again. Properly dressed this time, hair braided, but still early, still before the crew came in. She stood in the doorway and said, "The whole yard smells like this." "I know," Maeve said. "Papa's on the porch," Clara said. "He's been sitting there since 7. He said he wasn't waiting for anything." Maeve looked at the girl for a moment. "Do you believe him?" Clara thought about it seriously, the way she thought about most things. "Not really," she said. Maeve almost laughed, the closest she'd come all week. She put an arm around Clara's shoulders briefly, just lightly, because you didn't push with children who were still deciding whether they trusted you, and said, "Go tell him breakfast is ready. We'll eat together today." Clara went. And 2 riders from the Pemberton Ranch arrived at 11:30, which meant they'd left before dawn to make it by noon. They tied their horses at the fence and came to the cookhouse door with their hats already in their hands before Maeve even opened it, which told her everything she needed to know about why they'd come 9 miles on a Sunday morning. Not for curiosity, for the pie. The 2 riders from Pemberton Ranch were named Cal and Roy, and they were the kind of men who apologized for taking up space even when they'd been invited. They stood just inside the cookhouse door with their hats turning in their hands and looked at the table the way men look at something they want badly but haven't been told they're allowed to want yet. "We heard about the pies," Cal said. He was the older of the 2, maybe 50, with a mustache that had gone entirely white and the squinting look of someone who'd spent decades reading weather and cattle and other men's intentions. Didn't mean to impose. "You rode 9 miles, Maeve said. Sit down." They sat. Roy, the younger one, looked around the cookhouse with a kind of wondering attention, at the pies cooling on the table, at the organized pantry, at the general feeling of a room that had been thought about. "This place looks different than the last time I came through," he said to no one in particular. "Ted Burrows used to cook here. Place smelled like old grease and bad decisions." "Roy," Cal said, "I'm just saying it smells better now." Maeve put coffee in front of both of them, and they received it with the gratitude of men who had been riding since before the sun and understood the value of a hot cup of something. The rest of the crew came in at noon the way they always did, and found the 2 Pemberton men already at the table, and there was a moment of territorial assessment, the particular male version of figuring out whether a stranger is a threat or just a stranger. And then Holt sat down across from Cal and said, "You the Pemberton men Walt mentioned?" And Cal said yes, and Holt said, "Long ride for pie." And Cal said, "That's about right." And the matter was settled. Gideon Ashcroft came in with Clara at 5 past noon. Clara went directly to the seat she'd apparently claimed near the end of the table where she could see everything, and Gideon stood for a moment at the entrance the way he'd stood in the hallway when he first saw Maeve, taking inventory before committing to a reaction. He looked at his crew, at the 2 strangers, at the 9 pies, at Maeve. He sat down without saying anything, but he sat at the table, which he hadn't done for a single meal since Maeve arrived. She'd noticed his absence all week without remarking on it. Now she noticed his presence the same way. She served. Roast beef she'd put in before dawn, potatoes, green beans from the kitchen garden she'd found behind the main house on Friday, and asked Clara's permission to use, which Clara had granted with the gravity of someone conferring a significant honor. Bread. And then pie, the peach pies, 9 of them, carried from the cooling shelf and set down the center of the table in a row. The room got very quiet when the pies came out. Not the hostile quiet of Monday evening, a different kind entirely. Cal from Pemberton Ranch took his first bite and sat with his fork held still for a moment and said, "Miss, where did you cook before this?" "I ran a bakery," Maeve said, "in Tulsa. Why'd you leave?" "Fire," she said simply. Cal nodded as if this answered several questions at once. It was Clara who broke the silence that followed. She said, from her end of the table, without looking up from her plate, "Mrs. Callahan taught me how to make biscuits yesterday." She said it the way children announce things, as plain fact, requiring no commentary, simply true and therefore worth saying. Gideon looked at his daughter. Then he looked at Maeve. Maeve looked back at him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said on its own. After the meal, after the men had cleared out, and Roy and Cal had shaken Maeve's hand with the careful sincerity of men who meant it, after Clara had gone back to the main house with a leftover biscuit in her coat pocket, Gideon stayed. He stayed at the table while Maeve cleared plates, and he drank his coffee, and eventually he said, "The week's up tomorrow." "I know," Maeve said. "I've been listening to Walt. And the men." He turned his cup in his hands. "Holt told me what happened Monday night, the full version." She kept clearing plates. "I want to apologize for that," he said. "You shouldn't have been put in that situation on your first night." "It wasn't your doing," Maeve said. "It was my house," he said, "and my crew. And I wasn't here." He set the cup down. "That makes it mine regardless." She stopped clearing plates and looked at him. This was a man, she understood, who had the particular kind of exhaustion that came not from working too hard, but from holding too many things at once for too long. The ranch and the contract worries written all over his ledger, and a daughter who'd learned too early to take care of herself, and a woman in his household who had opinions about everything, and a crew that needed something he hadn't known how to give them. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Pass the trial. Permanent terms. We can discuss wages." Maeve picked up the next stack of plates. "I'd like to stay," she said. "Then we're agreed. On one condition." He looked at her. "I work with Walt on supplies, not Mrs. Mercer. Walt." A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "Agreed," he said. She nodded. He stood up, picked up his hat from the bench beside him, and left. She stood in the cookhouse with the clean plates in her hands and let herself feel, just briefly, the specific relief of a thing that has been precarious becoming slightly less so. Then she put the plates away and started planning Monday's meals. What Maeve did not fully understand yet, what she had no way of understanding in those early days, was that her presence at Iron Ridge had changed something in the invisible architecture of the place. Ranches ran on systems and routines that people didn't talk about because they'd stopped noticing them, the same way you stop noticing the sound of a clock in a room you've always lived in. But systems and routines could be wrong. They could be running on the wrong thing, and sometimes it takes a new person, someone who hasn't learned to not notice, to see it. What she saw, in the weeks that followed July into August, was that the men were hungry for more than food. Not in a sentimental way, in a practical, specific way. They were hungry for a place that felt like it was being run with intention, for meals that happened at the same time every day and tasted like someone had put thought into them. For a cookhouse that was clean and organized and didn't smell like old grease and bad decisions. These seem like small things. They are not small things. Holt, true to his word, showed up at 5:30 every morning to help with prep. He was not a delicate man, and he was not a natural cook's assistant, but he was willing, which covered most of the deficiency. He learned to peel without gouging. He learned to keep the fire at a consistent temperature rather than letting it run hot and then cold. He did not learn to measure properly. He had a constitutional inability to trust a measuring spoon. But Maeve learned to check behind him, which worked out to the same thing. Pete came by most evenings after supper with the transparent excuse of checking whether there were leftover biscuits, which sometimes there were and sometimes there weren't. On the evenings there weren't, he stayed anyway and talked, which Maeve came to understand was the actual point. He was from Kansas. He'd come to the territory at 17 with a cousin who'd subsequently gone back to Kansas, and he was trying to figure out who he was without a map for it, which was a thing Maeve recognized. "Did you always know you wanted to cook?" he asked her one evening in late July, sitting on the work table with his long legs dangling, the way young men sit when they haven't been told they shouldn't. "I didn't think of it as wanting to," Maeve said. She was grinding coffee for the next morning. "It was something I could do and something that needed doing. That's mostly how I've ended up doing things." "You're good at it, though." "I work at it," she said. "There's a difference." He thought about this with the earnest thoroughness of the young. "What happened to your husband?" She didn't break her rhythm with the grinder. "His heart. Last winter." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." "Were you—" He stopped. "Sorry, that's probably not—" "We were happy," she said, because she thought he was trying to ask whether the marriage had been a good one. "Not perfect, but genuinely happy. That's about as much as you can ask for." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to find something I'm good at." "You have time," Maeve said. "I'm almost 21. "Pete," she said, "you are deeply, catastrophically young." She said it without meanness, and he took it without offense, and he laughed. The kind of laugh that's partly embarrassed and partly relieved. And she handed him a biscuit from the tin she kept back from supper and told him to go to bed. In early August, the thing she'd been half waiting for happened. It arrived in the form of a letter. Not to Maeve, she had no reason to expect letters, but to Gideon, which Walt told her about indirectly, the way Walt communicated everything indirect, by mentioning it sideways while apparently focused on something else. "Big contract coming up," Walt said one morning while Maeve was starting the breakfast fire. He was refilling his coffee without looking at her. "Hanson Beef, biggest buyer in this part of the territory. They usually contract with Dalton Ridge." He paused. "Dalton Ridge has been undercutting us on price for 2 years. We haven't been competitive." Maeve turned the fire down a notch. When? Meetings in 3 weeks. Hanson's man is doing a tour of properties. Dalton Ridge is his last stop. Another pause. We're not on his list currently. She looked at Walt's profile. I was still looking at his coffee. Why are you telling me this? Because last week Roy from Pemberton mentioned it to their foreman, who mentioned it to someone at the Kiowa Creek Trading Post, who apparently mentioned to a passing stranger that the Iron Ridge Cookhouse was worth 9 miles out of anybody's way. Walt finally looked at her. I'm telling you because I think that fact matters, and I think you should know it matters. He left before she could ask him what he meant by that exactly. She thought about it all through breakfast and noon and into the afternoon. She understood ranching in the way you understand something that exists around you but wasn't your original subject. She'd picked it up from Daniel's cousins, from neighbors in Tulsa, from the 6 weeks she'd spent at a cattle yard in '86 when the bakery had gone through a slow patch and she'd taken temporary work in their kitchen. She knew enough to know that a major beef contract was the difference between a ranch that survived a bad winter and one that didn't. She knew enough to know that Gideon's ledger, the one she'd glimpsed through the open study door, had numbers in it that were not comfortable. She also knew something that Walt perhaps hadn't fully articulated, even to himself, that what the Pemberton riders had come 9 miles for on a Sunday morning was not just the pie. It was the feeling of a place that was being run right, that was welcoming, that had, in the particular way of a good table, made them feel like they mattered. That was not a small thing to a man coming to do business. She was thinking about all of this when Evelyn walked into the cookhouse at 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon and set a piece of paper on the table. It was not a supply list this time. I want you to read this, Evelyn said. Maeve dried her hands on her apron and looked at the paper. It was a letter, handwritten, addressed to Gideon. She read the first 2 lines and then looked up. This is addressed to Mr. Ashcroft, she said. I'm aware. You're showing me someone else's letter. I wrote it, Evelyn said. Her voice was entirely steady, which was more unsettling than anger would have been. I haven't sent it yet. I wanted you to see it first. Maeve looked back at the letter. It was short. It described, in measured language, a series of concerns about Maeve's suitability for the position. It mentioned her background, the fire, the failed bakery, a husband dead in the first year of the decade. It used words like unstable circumstances and uncertain character and questions regarding reliability. None of it was technically a lie. All of it was designed to suggest something worse than the truth. Maeve set the letter down. Why are you showing me this? She said. Because I'm giving you the choice, Evelyn said. Leave before I send it, and I won't send it. Stay, and it goes to Gideon tomorrow. The room held the kind of quiet that has weight. Maeve looked at the woman across the table from her. She'd been trying, since the first afternoon, to understand Evelyn Mercer. Not to excuse her, but to understand her, because understanding was more useful than anger. What she saw now was not cruelty exactly. It was fear. The specific fear of someone who has built their whole position on a foundation that is secretly fragile and who sees the new cook's growing competence as a thing that threatens not just that position, but the entire life constructed around it. Evelyn had been managing this household for 2 years. She'd been the woman at the center of it. She'd been the person Clara turned to, the person the men worked around, the person Gideon consulted because there was no one else. Whatever grief she carried for her sister, it had become mixed up with a kind of ownership that she'd probably stopped being able to distinguish from love. None of that made the letter right. Mrs. Mercer, Maeve said carefully, Mr. Ashcroft already knows about the fire. He already knows about my husband. I told him myself when we spoke. Something flickered in Evelyn's expression. I don't have secrets to protect, Maeve continued, and I'm not going to leave because of a letter that describes the truth and calls it something worse. Evelyn's jaw set. You think he'll keep you on when I tell him you're a liability to this ranch? I think Mr. Ashcroft is a grown man who can read a letter and make his own judgment. Maeve picked up the letter and held it out. If you want to send it, send it. That's between you and him. Evelyn took the letter back. Her hand was perfectly steady, but her eyes had changed, gone somewhere harder and less certain at the same time, which is a difficult combination to hold in a face and which people usually can't sustain for long. She left without another word. Maeve stood in the cookhouse after she'd gone, and breathe through the feeling of having done the right thing without any certainty that the right thing was going to work out. She didn't know if Evelyn would send the letter. She didn't know if it would matter if she did. She didn't know whether Gideon Ashcroft would weigh a description of her circumstances against what he'd seen with his own eyes and make the right call, because people don't always make the right call, even people who are basically decent. And Gideon Ashcroft being basically decent was the most accurate thing she could say about him with any confidence after 2 weeks. She made supper. It was the only thing she could do. She made it better than she had to, not to prove a point, but because the only way she knew to deal with uncertainty was to do the next thing as well as she could and then do the thing after that. The letter did go to Gideon. She knew it had because Walt told her 2 days later, sideways, and while looking at something else. Mr. Ashcroft wanted me to tell you he'll be at supper tonight. A pause. He also said to tell you nothing's changed. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for 48 hours. But it wasn't nothing. It wasn't nothing because Evelyn knew now that the direct approach hadn't worked, and people who are determined don't stop when the direct approach fails. They change direction. Maeve had grown around enough difficult people to know that the ones who sent letters that didn't work were often the ones you needed to be most careful about afterward. She was right to be careful. In the second week of August, 3 things happened that seemed unrelated and weren't. The first was that Clara started appearing at the cookhouse every morning. Not just sometimes. Every morning. She came before the crew, before Holt, usually before full light, and she sat on her stool and she watched Maeve work, and occasionally she helped, and more often than that she talked. She talked the way children talk when they found someone they trust, not in complete narratives, but in pieces. Little irregular fragments of the interior life, offered sideways. She talked about her mother sometimes. Not often, just occasionally, a reference inserted into another conversation, like a door that opened briefly and then closed again. She said once, entirely without drama, "Mama used to hum when she cooked. Do you hum?" And Maeve said, "Not while I'm cooking, sometimes while I'm walking." Clara accepted this as adequate. She said another time, "Aunt Evelyn doesn't like me coming here in the mornings." "I know," Maeve said. "She thinks I'm bothering you." "You're not bothering me." Clara was quiet for a moment, then, "She's been here a long time, since before Mama died even. She used to come for visits." Another pause. "She cried a lot when Mama died. I thought she'd leave after a while, but she didn't." Maeve turned this information over in her mind. "Do you like having her here?" she asked. Clara thought about this with her characteristic serious thoroughness. "She tries," she said finally. "She tries a lot. It's just that she tries in the wrong direction sometimes." Maeve thought that was one of the more accurate descriptions of a person she'd heard in a long time, and she filed it away. The second thing that happened was that Roy from the Pemberton Ranch came back. Not on a Sunday. On a Tuesday, in the middle of the week, which meant he'd ridden out for a reason other than pie. He brought 2 other men from Pemberton with him, and they arrived at noon and ate with the Iron Ridge crew, with the slightly self-conscious friendliness of people from neighboring territories who are discovering they don't actually have anything to be unfriendly about. After the meal, Roy found Maeve at the back of the cookhouse and said, low enough that only she could hear, "There's a man named Hanson coming through this territory in about 2 weeks, doing a contract tour." Maeve looked at him. "I've heard. He's stopping at 3 properties. Dalton Ridge is one of them." Roy turned his hat in his hands. "I've eaten at Dalton Ridge. Their cook is decent, but decent isn't what people are talking about when they talk about Iron Ridge." He met her eyes briefly. "Someone should make sure he stops here." "That's not my decision to make," Maeve said. "No," Roy agreed, "but maybe you know who to talk to." He left with his 2 companions after another cup of coffee each. Maeve stood in the cookhouse doorway watching them ride out and thought about what he'd said and what it actually meant, and whether she was willing to do what it was pointing toward. The third thing was the hardest. It was a Saturday evening, and Clara was in the cookhouse later than usual. Maeve had let her stay because they'd been making a second attempt at biscuits together, Clara's technique improving considerably from her first try, when Evelyn appeared in the doorway. She stood there for a moment looking at the scene. Clara at the work table with flour on her hands, Maeve beside her, guiding the shaping process with a light word here and there. The 2 of them together in the warm lamplight of the cookhouse, easy in each other's company in the way that develops slowly and then seems like it was always there. Evelyn's face when she took that in was not the face of a scheming woman. It was the face of someone who had just seen clearly something she'd been pretending she couldn't see. "Clara," she said, "it's past your bedtime." "We're finishing the biscuits," Clara said. "They can be finished tomorrow." "They can't. They have to go in the oven now, or they won't be right." Clara looked up at Maeve. "Right?" "Your aunt's right that it's late," Maeve said carefully. "Put the last two on the pan and we'll have everything in 2 minutes." Clara put the last two on the pan. She was good at it now. The shapes weren't perfect, but they were consistent, which was better. Maeve slid the pan in and they waited the necessary time, and then the biscuits came out and Maeve wrapped 2 of them in a cloth for Clara to take to bed. Clara took them, said goodnight to Maeve with a directness that was entirely her own, and went to Evelyn at the door. Evelyn put a hand on her shoulder and turned to go. Then she stopped. And she said, without turning back, in a voice from which she'd removed everything identifiable, "You're good with her." Maeve waited. "Margaret was good with her too," Evelyn said, still not turning. Clara was her whole world. A pause that pulled at something. "Mine too, honestly, after Margaret went." Maeve didn't say anything. She understood that some things need the silence around them to be what they are. Evelyn took Clara and left. Maeve stood in the cookhouse alone for a while after, with the smell of biscuits and the sound of nothing particular, and felt the specific weight of complicated situations that do not have easy resolutions and probably shouldn't. She went to see Gideon the next morning, Sunday morning, before the crew was up, before Clara had appeared on her stool. She knocked on the study door and he said, "Come in," and he was already at the desk with the ledger, which told her he hadn't slept well. "I need to talk to you about the Hansen contract," she said. He looked up. "What do you know about the Hansen contract?" "Enough. I know you need it. I know Dalton Ridge is better positioned to get it, and I have an idea that might change that, but I need you to tell me it's all right to try it before I do anything." He set his pen down. He leaned back in the chair, which creaked with the particular honesty of old furniture. "Tell me." "I want to send Hansen's man a pie," she said. Gideon stared at her. "With an invitation to dine at Iron Ridge," she said, "before he goes to Dalton Ridge. I want to give him a reason to come here first." Silence. "You want to win a cattle contract," Gideon said slowly, "with a peach pie." "I want to give him a reason to see this ranch," Maeve said. "The pie is just the reason. What he'll see when he gets here, the crew, the land, the way this place runs, that's what will win it." She watched him thinking. She watched him look at the ledger, and then look away from it, and then look at the ceiling briefly, and then at her. "Where's he staying?" Gideon asked. "Roy from Pemberton told me he'd be at the Kiowa Creek stopping house the night of the 14th, Maeve said. "That's 9 days from now." Another silence. This one different from the others. "You'd have to bake the pie fresh," he said, "to get it there in reasonable condition. I'd send it the morning of the 14th. It would arrive by afternoon." "And the note?" "Short," Maeve said. "Nothing fancy, just an invitation. His name and the address of Iron Ridge and a time." Gideon picked up his pen and put it down again. He was a man who had probably made dozens of decisions over the course of his life that turned on a moment like this, and he looked like he knew it. "All right," he said. Maeve nodded. She turned to go. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. She looked back. "If this works," he said, "and I'm not saying it will." "Neither am I," she said. "If it works, it's because of everything that's happened here since July, not just the pie." He said it the way he said most things, directly, without decoration. "I want you to know I understand that." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and meant it for more than just this conversation. She walked back across the yard in the early morning light, the ranch around her just beginning to stir, the bunkhouse starting to produce the sounds of men getting up, and she began in her mind the precise calculations of what she would need and when she would need to start, and exactly how many peaches were still left on those old trees behind the shed, and whether 9 days and whatever was left on those branches would be enough to change the future of Iron Ridge Ranch. 9 days is not a long time. 9 days is exactly long enough to understand how little time you have. Maeve counted them from the morning she left Gideon's study. She counted them the way you count something that matters. Not obsessively, but with the specific awareness of a person who knows the difference between time wasted and time used. She had 9 days to make sure that when a man named Hanson's representative rode onto Iron Ridge property, what he found was a ranch worth betting on. The pie she could control. The rest of it was more complicated. She started with what she knew. The peach orchard had maybe 40 pounds of fruit left on it. She went back out the morning after her conversation with Gideon and counted carefully, pulling a few branches down to check what was actually ripe versus what only looked ripe from the ground. 40 pounds was enough for 6 good pies, maybe 7 if she was careful, and the fruit didn't turn on her before the 14th. She needed one perfect pie. She needed it to arrive at the Kiowa Creek stopping house in a condition that made a man stop whatever he was doing and read the note tucked alongside it. She'd been thinking about the note since Sunday, and she still wasn't satisfied with it. She'd written 4 versions on the back of a flour sack, which was the paper she had available, and thrown 3 of them away mentally. Too formal was wrong. Too casual was wrong. What she wanted was something in between. Something that felt like an invitation from a real place run by real people rather than a sales pitch dressed up in good manners. She finally settled on 7 sentences. She didn't show them to Gideon because she didn't want his instinct to make it more formal. She showed them to Walt, who read it twice and said, "That'll do," which from Walt was approximately equivalent to another man saying it was the finest piece of writing he'd encountered in recent memory. The logistics of getting the pie to Kiowa Creek by the afternoon of the 14th took 2 days to arrange. Roy from Pemberton, when Maeve sent a message asking whether he knew anyone making that run, sent word back that his cousin was hauling feed through Kiowa Creek on the 14th and would be glad to carry something for Iron Ridge. She didn't ask what Roy had told his cousin or why his cousin would be glad to do it. Some things you accepted and moved forward. What she hadn't anticipated, what she should have anticipated because she'd learned enough about Evelyn Mercer by now to know better, was that Evelyn had been listening, not deliberately eavesdropping. At least Maeve chose to believe it wasn't deliberate, because believing otherwise required a kind of sustained suspicion she didn't have the energy to maintain. But the house was not large, and study doors were not always fully closed, and Evelyn was a woman who paid attention to things. She came to the cookhouse on Monday morning, 4 days before the pie was supposed to leave. She came in the way she always came in, without knocking, with the air of someone making a point about whose territory this was. But this time there was something different in her face, something tighter than usual, more decided. "I know what you're planning," she said. Maeve was rolling pie crust. She didn't stop. "Then you know it's Mr. Ashcroft's decision," Maeve said. "He's already approved it." He approved it without fully understanding the risk. "What risk?" Evelyn pulled a chair from the table and sat down across from Maeve. This was new. Evelyn usually stood. Sitting meant something different. It meant she was prepared to have a longer conversation. "If Hanson's man comes here and doesn't give us the contract," Evelyn said, "we've made Iron Ridge look desperate. Dalton Ridge will hear about it. Their owner is not a man who misses opportunities to use information." Maeve pressed the crust into the pan. "And if he comes here and gives us the contract?" "You're a cook," Evelyn said. Not cruelly, precisely. "What you know about cattle contracts isn't enough to be confident about a gamble like this." Maeve turned and looked at her. "What do you know about them?" A pause. The question had landed differently than Evelyn expected. "My father ran cattle," Evelyn said after a moment, "before he lost everything in '71. I grew up watching him make decisions like this." "And?" "And some of them worked," Evelyn said, "and some of them made things worse very quickly." The 2 women looked at each other across the pie pan. "I'm not saying you're wrong," Maeve said. "I'm saying the risk of not trying is the same ranch that can't pay its debts through winter. I'd rather gamble on something real than lose slowly." She turned back to the crust. "You can tell Mr. Ashcroft your concerns. That's between you and him." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something Maeve hadn't expected. "What do you need?" Maeve turned. "To make this work," Evelyn said. Her expression was not warm exactly, but it was different from anything Maeve had seen in it before. "What do you need that you don't currently have?" The silence that followed was the most complicated one they'd shared. "Butter," Maeve said finally. "I've been short on butter all month, and a decent tablecloth for the main table. I've been using the work cloth, and it looks like what it is. And if there's any way to get the bunkhouse fence repainted before the 14th, that would help." A man rides in, and the first thing he sees, "I can get the butter," Evelyn said. I'll speak to Walt about the fence. She stood up, smoothing her skirt in the way she always did when concluding a scene. The tablecloth. I have Margaret's. It's in the cedar chest upstairs. Maeve said nothing. She would have wanted it used, Evelyn said. And the way she said it was the most honest thing Maeve had heard her say, because it had grief in it that wasn't managed. Thank you, Maeve said. Evelyn left. Maeve stood with the rolling pin in her hand for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, feeling the strange, uncomfortable sensation of a person you've been bracing against suddenly stepping to the side. The butter appeared the next morning, 2 full pounds of it, left on the cookhouse step without comment. The bunkhouse fence got 3 coats of fresh white paint by Thursday, applied by Pete and 2 other men who apparently had been told this was happening and had raised no objection. The tablecloth, white linen with a narrow blue border, slightly yellowed at the fold lines but clean and clearly cared for, appeared on the cookhouse table on Wednesday, folded precisely, with no note. Maeve unfolded it and put it on the table and stood looking at it for a minute. Then she went and got the iron and pressed the fold lines out, which took longer than she'd expected because the linen was the good kind, thick and resistant, the kind that kept the shape it had decided to keep and required persuasion to change. The crew noticed the tablecloth. They didn't say anything about it directly, but she saw them register it, the slight adjustment in how they sat at the table, the extra second before Dooley put his boots up on the bench and then thought better of it. Small things. The kind of things a tablecloth can do to a room without anyone deciding to let it. Clara came in Friday morning and stopped when she saw it. That's Mama's, she said. Your Aunt Evelyn lent it, Maeve said, for next week, when we have a visitor. Clara ran her hand along the edge of it, just the border, carefully. Mama got it from her mother, Clara said. Grandma Hetty. Papa always said it was the fanciest thing in the house. She looked up at Maeve. He's going to see it. I expect so. Will that be okay? Maeve thought about the right answer. I think it'll be more than okay, she said. I think your mama's things being used is what things are for. Clara stood there for a moment more. Then she sat on her stool and watched Maeve work, and neither of them said anything else about it, and somehow that was the right way to handle it. The pie went out the morning of the 14th with Roy's cousin, whose name was Archie, and who appeared at the cookhouse gate at 6:15 on a wagon that smelled powerfully of feed grain. Maeve had the pie in a wooden crate padded with flour sacks, the note tucked in an envelope placed flat on top of it. She handed it up to Archie, who looked at it with a respect that suggested Roy had explained something of the situation. I'll get it there careful, he said. I know you will, she said. She watched the wagon go down the road and then stood at the gate for an extra moment after it had disappeared, with the particular feeling of having sent something irretrievable out into the world and now having to wait for whatever came back. There was nothing to do after that except cook, so she cooked. The regular meals, the regular rhythm, nothing different in the exterior of it. She didn't tell the crew about Hanson's man. Gideon had asked her not to, not yet, because he didn't want the men performing for a visitor rather than being themselves, which Maeve thought showed more understanding of people than she'd initially given him credit for. She told Holt, because Holt was going to notice if something was different and ask about it with the particular unstoppable directness of a large man who had decided he deserved a straight answer. She told him on Thursday evening, briefly and without much detail, just enough so he understood what the meal on the evening of the 15th needed to be. Holt was quiet for a moment, absorbing it. Then he said, Should I tell the men to behave? I'd rather they be themselves, Maeve said. Can you tell them to be their best version of themselves without telling them why? He thought about this seriously. I can tell them the boss is having an important guest, and I'd appreciate them not being jackasses. That'll work, Maeve said. He nodded and left, and she heard him talking to 3 men near the bunkhouse in a voice too low to make out words, and the next morning there was a general air of slightly better than usual boot cleaning and collar straightening that was subtle enough to pass for a Tuesday, but was not, in fact, accidental. The word came back from Archie via Roy on the morning of the 15th. The message was 4 words, delivered by a boy on a horse who'd clearly been told to be quick about it. He read it twice. Maeve put the message in her apron pocket and went back to the stove. Gideon came to the cookhouse at 9, something he now did with enough regularity that it had stopped seeming unusual. He poured himself coffee without asking, which was its own kind of progress, and stood leaning against the far wall. "Roy's boy just came through," he said. "I know." He read it twice. "So Roy's boy said." Gideon turned his cup in his hands. "Is that good?" "A man who throws something away reads it once," Maeve said. "Reading it twice means he's thinking." Gideon nodded slowly. He looked at the tablecloth. He stood looking at it for a moment longer than necessary. "Evelyn's," he said. "Margaret's," Maeve said. "Evelyn lent it." He was quiet. She let him be quiet because some silences are not fulfilling. "She was a good woman," he said finally. "Not Evelyn." She understood he meant Margaret. "I'm not good at talking about her. I never have been." "You don't have to be," Maeve said. "Clara talks about her more now." He looked at Maeve then, directly. "Since you came." Maeve kept stirring. "I thought that would be, He stopped. "I wasn't sure whether it would be good or hard for her." "It's probably both," Maeve said. "At the same time. That's usually how those things work." He nodded once. He finished his coffee and left. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a horse came up the road. One horse, one rider. A man of about 60, compact and dry-looking in the way of someone who had been making long journeys for so many decades that they'd stopped being remarkable, wearing a decent coat that was dusty from the road and carrying a leather satchel across the saddle that looked like it had been everywhere. Walt met him at the gate, and Maeve watched from the cookhouse window. The man's name was Howard Beale. He was not himself Hanson. She'd understood from the beginning that it would be Hanson's representative, not Hanson himself, which was actually better, because men who represented other men usually had more room to be impressed by things and more interest in reporting them accurately. Hanson himself would have been comparing to a standard. Beale was looking to have a recommendation to make. She watched Walt shake his hand and take his horse and point him toward the main house, and she turned back to the stove. She had started the evening meal at noon. The beef, the best cut from the current supply, which she'd spoken to Walt about a week ago specifically for this, had been slow cooking for 3 hours already. The bread had gone in at 2 and would come out at 5, giving it an hour to cool and be right. The beans were long past the point of needing attention and just needed to be left alone, which was what most things needed if you gave them enough time. The pie, one of the 6 she'd made from the remaining orchard fruit, saved specifically for tonight, was on the shelf. She had also made something she hadn't told anyone about. A soup. Her mother's recipe, the one she'd made from memory because the card had gotten wet once, and the ink had run but the proportions lived in her hands. It was nothing impressive to look at. Broth, garden vegetables, a bay leaf, some black pepper. It was the kind of thing that didn't make a man stop and stare. It just made him, at the end of the first spoonful, feel like he was somewhere he recognized, even if he'd never been there before. She'd learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing you could put on a table was comfort, not novelty, comfort. At 6 o'clock, the crew came in. They came in fractionally better than usual. The shirts were tucked, the boots had been at least nominally addressed, nobody came in mid-argument, and they found Howard Beale already seated at the head of the table with Gideon beside him. The tablecloth was on. The lamp was clean and full of oil and threw a good warm light. Clara was there too, at her end, with her book on her knee under the table in case she needed it, which she wouldn't. The men sat. Maeve served. She moved around the table without ceremony, without spectacle, just the steady rhythm of a person doing a job they know. Beale watched her the way a man watches something he's trying to understand without being obvious about trying to understand it. She didn't acknowledge that she noticed. The soup went first. Beale took a spoonful, and she wasn't watching him, but she was. In the peripheral way you learn to watch things you can't afford to miss. And she saw him go still for exactly the right amount of time. The conversation at the table was the conversation the crew always had. It was not performed. Holt was talking about a section of fence on the north side that had gone down in Thursday's wind and what he planned to do about it. Pete was being told by 2 older men that he was wrong about something, which was most of Pete's social life. 2 of the men who'd been there when Beale came in were asking him careful questions about the cattle market, the kind of questions that were genuinely curious rather than strategic, because they were men who worked cattle and wanted to know what was happening to cattle prices. Beale answered those questions with the directness of someone who was used to being asked for information and didn't mind providing it. He thawed, Maeve thought. That was the only word for it. The way a man's posture changes when he realizes he's in a room that doesn't want anything from him except for him to sit down and eat. She brought the bread. She brought the beef. She brought more coffee before anyone asked for it, which was the trick of it. The asking is what breaks the spell. At some point, she couldn't have said exactly when, Clara put her book on the table and started talking to Beale about something. Maeve caught fragments of it, Clara asking where he'd come from, Beale explaining the route, Clara telling him with casual authority that the road through the creek bend was better in August than the road over the hill. Beale listening to her with the full attention he'd clearly given adult, which was the right thing to do with Clara, and not everyone understood it. Gideon was watching his daughter. Maeve saw his face when he watched her, and it was the same face as when he'd talked about Margaret that morning. Something in it that was partly sorrow and partly something quieter than sorrow. Recognition, maybe. The kind you feel when something lost comes back in a form you didn't anticipate. She brought the pie at the end, just the one, to the table whole, which she almost never did. She usually sliced in the kitchen, but tonight she wanted to bring it whole and set it down and let the smell of it be the announcement. It worked the way smells work when they carry memory in them. The table got quiet for just a moment. Beale looked at it, and his expression did something brief and private that she didn't try to read. She cut and served. Beale ate his slice. He put his fork down. He picked it back up and ate another bite. He set the fork down a second time and looked at Maeve, who was at the other end of the table. "Mrs. he started. "Callahan," Gideon said. "Mrs. Callahan." Beale looked at her steadily. "I received a pie at the Kiowa Creek house yesterday with a note. The note said I should see this ranch before I made any decisions." A pause. "I almost didn't come. I had a schedule." The table had gotten quieter. "I'm glad I came," Beale said. Maeve nodded once. That was all. The meal ended the way a good meal ends, not with a bang, but with a gradual, satisfied unwillingness to be over. Men sat longer than usual. Beale and Gideon moved to the far end of the table with a second cup of coffee and a ledger that Walt produced, and Maeve heard the low cadence of a business conversation beginning, but did not try to hear the content. She cleared the table. She washed up. She moved around the men who remained on the benches, and they moved slightly to give her room without being asked, the unconscious courtesy of people who've gotten used to sharing a space with someone. Pete, drying a plate she'd handed him, said quietly, "How'd we do?" "We'll see," Maeve said. He dried the plate with the careful earnestness of someone who understood that how you dried a plate while waiting for important news was itself a form of keeping your nerve. It was 9 o'clock when Gideon walked Beale out to where his horse had been stabled. Maeve heard them talking on the step. Not the words, just the tone. And then she heard Beale's horse on the road, and then there was quiet. Gideon came back in. The cookhouse was empty except for Maeve, who was finishing the last of the washing up. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand. She turned. His expression was not the expression of a man delivering bad news, but it was also not the simple, uncomplicated face of triumph. It was more layered than that, more tired, more real. "He's going to recommend Iron Ridge for the contract," Gideon said. "He said he needs to make the Dalton Ridge visit as scheduled, but barring something extraordinary there, his recommendation is ours." Maeve set down the cloth she'd been holding. "He also said—" Gideon stopped. He looked at the tablecloth on the table, the good linen one with the blue border. He said this felt like a place that had its priorities right. He said he'd been doing this work for 11 years, and he could tell a ranch that knew what it was from one that didn't. He was quiet for a moment. "I haven't had that said about this place in a long time," he said. Not complaining, just honest. "It's a good place," Maeve said. "It needed to know it again." He looked at her. Something in his face settled, the way a thing settles when it's been holding a shape for a long time and is finally allowed to be still. "Thank you," he said, "for the pie, for the note, for—" He made a small gesture that encompassed the cookhouse and the tablecloth and probably a number of things neither of them was going to name out loud. "All of it." "You hired me," she said, "and you kept me on when you didn't have to." "Walt kept you on," he said, with the faint suggestion of a smile. "I just signed off on it." She almost laughed. She didn't, quite. But it was close. He left. She stood in the clean cookhouse with the lamp burning low and the tablecloth still on the table, and the smell of peach and pastry and good coffee still in the air, and she thought about a fire in March, and a carpet bag and $2.40, and a road that had led here with the peculiar indifference of roads to where they're taking you. She thought about Evelyn Mercer going to a cedar chest and taking out a tablecloth and folding it precisely and leaving it on a table without a note, because some things couldn't be attached to a note without becoming something else. She thought about Clara's hands shaping a biscuit with the intensity of a child learning to do something the right way for the first time. She thought about 40 untouched plates in July and the orchard she'd found in the dark and the decision to start the fire again, and how that decision had felt at the time like it was only about surviving the night, but had turned out to be about considerably more than that. Outside, the ranch was quiet. The bunkhouse had gone dark. The peach orchard behind the storage shed was just a shape in the darkness, its job done, its fruit given over to whatever this summer had needed it for. Maeve turned off the lamp. She went to her room in the back. She was asleep within minutes, which was the deep unconscious sleep of a person who has spent everything they had on something that mattered and found out, just barely in time, that it was enough. The official word from Hanson Beef came 11 days after Howard Beale rode back down the Iron Ridge Road into the dark. 11 days was long enough for doubt to settle in and make itself comfortable, long enough for Maeve to start each morning with the same careful discipline she always had, and end each evening wondering whether Beale's words at the table had been genuine or merely the polite performance of a man who'd eaten well and didn't want to be rude about it. Long enough for Gideon to go quiet in the particular way he went quiet when he was carrying something he wasn't sharing with anyone. The crew didn't know to wait for anything specific, but they could read the atmosphere of a ranch the way they read weather, without knowing exactly how they knew, just feeling the pressure change. Holt showed up to morning prep without being reminded. Pete stopped leaving dishes half-dried. Nobody picked unnecessary fights, which for a bunkhouse of 40 men was its own kind of miracle. On the 26th of August, Walt came to the cookhouse at 2 in the afternoon holding a letter with the particular careful way people hold things they understand the weight of. He set it on the table in front of Maeve without saying anything. She looked at it. Hanson Beef Company, printed across the top in good ink on good paper. She looked at Walt. "Mr. Ashcroft's in the south field," Walt said. "I thought you should see it first." She opened it. She read it once, all the way through, and then she read it again, because that's what you do with something you've been waiting on for 11 days and can't quite trust the first reading of. It was formal language, the careful contractual prose of men who did business in large numbers and wanted no misunderstandings. But the meaning was plain. Iron Ridge Ranch had been awarded the Hanson Beef contract for the following year, renewable annually pending performance review. The terms were better than what Dalton Ridge had been getting. Howard Beale's accompanying note, 2 lines at the bottom in different handwriting, said simply, "A ranch that knows what it is. Recommend without reservation." Maeve set the letter down on the table. She put both hands flat on it for a moment, not dramatically, just needing to feel something solid. "Go get Mr. Ashcroft," she said. Walt went. She put the kettle on because it was the only thing to do with her hands while she waited, and stood at the stove looking at nothing in particular and feeling the specific quality of a relief that has been earned rather than given. It didn't feel like she'd imagined it would feel. It felt quieter, more interior. Like something that had been held at a slight angle had finally been allowed to go level. Gideon came in still dusty from the field, Walt 2 steps behind him. He looked at the letter on the table and then at Maeve. She nodded. He picked it up. He read it. He set it back down and stood for a moment with his hand still on it, looking at the floor between him and Maeve with the expression of a man who is trying to decide whether what he's feeling is real enough to trust yet. "Walt," he said. "Sir." "Tell the men tonight at supper." "Yes, sir." Walt was almost to the door when Gideon said his name again. Walt stopped. "Thank you," Gideon said, "for everything this summer." Walt nodded once, briefly, the way men out there acknowledged things that mattered but didn't require commentary. Then he was gone. Gideon and Maeve stood in the cookhouse with the letter between them and the kettle starting to whisper on the stove. "We did it," he said, not triumphant, just true. "The ranch did it," Maeve said. "I sent a pie. The rest of it was already here." He looked at her then, with an expression she'd seen building in pieces over 2 months. In the study doorway, at the table watching Clara, in the moments he lingered past the point where a man lingers just for coffee. She'd seen it coming, and she'd let herself see it coming because there was no point in pretending she hadn't. even to herself. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. "Maeve," she said, because they were past Mrs. Callahan and had been for a while. "Maeve." He said it like he was trying it out, which was honest. "I'm not good at this. I should tell you that up front." "At what?" "At—" He made a small gesture with one hand that covered a lot of ground. "At saying things directly that aren't about cattle or weather or fence lines." "Try anyway," she said. He took a breath. He was a man who had stood in fields and made decisions about animals and land and money with a steadiness that held in most weather, and he looked considerably less steady right now, which she found she didn't mind. "I don't want you to stay because you need the work," he said. "I mean, I want you to stay for that reason too, because you're the best cook this ranch has had, and the crew is different since you came and I can see it. But I'm not talking about the work right now." "I know you're not," Maeve said. "Clara—" He stopped. Started again. "Clara talked about her mother more in the last 2 months than she has in 2 years. And I don't know entirely how to feel about that, because part of it hurts, and part of it is the biggest relief I've had since Margaret died. And those two things sitting together in the same feeling is something I'm still figuring out." Maeve was quiet. She understood this. She understood it from her own version of it. Daniel's photograph in the tin she still hadn't opened, the bakery she still sometimes dreamed about in the specific sensory way of places you've lost. The way grief doesn't finish. It just changes shape. You don't stop carrying it. You just get better at carrying it while doing other things. "I'm not asking you to replace anything," he said. "I know better than to ask that." "Good," she said. "Because I couldn't." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "But I think you might be something else. Something that isn't a replacement for what's gone. Just something new and real." He looked at her directly. "I'm not explaining this well." "You're explaining it fine," Maeve said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "I'd like to court you properly, if you're willing. I understand if you're not. I understand if it's too soon or if it's complicated or if you just don't—" "Gideon," she said. He stopped. "Ask me properly," she said. "Not all the exits first." He held her gaze. Something in his face steadied, the way things steady, when you stop trying to protect yourself from a situation and just walk into it. "Would you let me court you?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Just that." "Yes." No conditions attached, no qualifications, no careful management of expectations. She'd been careful and managed and conditional about everything for 2 solid months out of pure survival necessity, and this one thing she was going to answer simply. He looked like a man who had been prepared for a more complicated answer and wasn't sure what to do with the simple one. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, and turned back to the kettle because supper still needed making. She heard him almost leave and then pause, and then say, from near the door, "Maeve." She looked over her shoulder. "Thank you," he said, "for the pie. For all of it. I know I said it before." "You can say it again," she said. "I don't mind." He left. She didn't drink and stood at the stove feeling something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten the texture of it. The specific warmth of being somewhere you chose rather than somewhere you landed. The difference between those two things is not nothing. It is, in fact, almost everything. The supper that night was the loudest the cookhouse had been since Maeve arrived. Walt told the crew about the contract in the flat, factual way Walt told things, but the crew's response was not flat or factual at all. There was a noise that was close to a shout, and someone, she suspected Pete, knocked over a coffee cup that fortunately was empty, and Holt stood up from the bench and said, with the particular loud satisfaction of a man who is rarely wrong about people and knows it, "I told you all in July that this was going to be something," which was not, as far as Maeve could recall, something he'd said in July, but nobody was going to argue with him about it tonight. Gideon was at the table. Clara was at the table. And this was the thing Maeve hadn't expected. Evelyn was at the table. She came in quietly, just before supper was served, and sat at the end near Clara without any ceremony, without the particular entrance she usually made. Clara, without looking up from her plate, shifted slightly on the bench to make room. It was such a small gesture, so unconsciously done. And Evelyn sat in the space Clara made, and something in her posture was different from every previous time Maeve had seen her sit down in that room. Maeve served her without comment. Evelyn ate without comment. But at some point during the meal, when the noise was at its highest, and the men were talking over each other about what the contract meant for spring and whether they'd need to expand the herd, and who was going to have to ride out to check the eastern boundary before winter came. In the middle of all of that, Evelyn looked across the table at Maeve and gave a single small nod. Not an apology, not a surrender, just an acknowledgement. Woman to woman, across the length of a table laid with a dead woman's tablecloth, in a room full of men who had no idea that the most consequential conversation of the evening was happening without a word. Maeve nodded back. That was all it was. That was enough. The weeks that followed were not perfect, because nothing is perfect, and anyone who tells you a ranch in August of 1889 ran like a clock is either lying or wasn't paying attention. The new contract brought new work and new pressure and new logistical problems that Walt handled with his usual grim competence. Two of the men got into a real fight over something Maeve never fully understood, and one of them had a black eye for a week. The oven ran hot for 3 days in September, and she burned 2 batches of bread before figuring out that the damper had shifted and needed adjusting, which Pete finally did by climbing half into the firebox with a wrench in a way that was alarming to watch but effective. Evelyn didn't become easy. That's the truth of it. She was still a woman who occupied a house like she'd decided it was hers, and anyone else in it was a guest she hadn't fully approved. She still had opinions about Clara's schedule and the household accounts, and the right way to air out the upstairs rooms. But the opinions had a different quality after that night. Less weaponized, more just Evelyn. The way a person is when they're not trying to win something. She and Maeve developed a working relationship that neither of them would have described as friendship, and both of them would have called, if pressed, reliable. They met on Mondays to go over the household accounts. They disagreed about things. They resolved the disagreements the way competent people resolve them, by establishing whose territory was whose and mostly staying in it. Once, in early October, when Clara had come home from a ride with a cut on her forehead that was not serious but looked worse than it was, Evelyn and Maeve had spent 45 minutes together in the kitchen cleaning and bandaging it, Clara sitting stoically on the work table eating a biscuit and complaining about the fuss, and the two women working around each other in the small space with the easy efficiency of people who know what they're doing and have stopped worrying about what the other one thinks of them. When it was done and Clara had gone back outside, Evelyn had said, "She's tough," and Maeve had said, "She gets it from somewhere," and Evelyn had said, "Margaret was tough," and Maeve had said, "I believe it," and that was the most they'd ever said to each other about Margaret directly, and it was somehow the right amount. Gideon courted Maeve in the way of a man who had not done this in a long time and was trying to remember how. He was not smooth about it. He brought her things, useful things, not romantic things, because romantic things didn't seem to occur to him naturally. But he brought her a better quality rolling pin in September because he'd noticed hers had a wobble in it, and he fixed the draft issue under the cookhouse door that had been letting cold air in without her having to mention it, and he started eating every meal in the cookhouse instead of half of them at the main house, which was its own form of declaration. He talked to her. That was the thing that mattered most. He came in some evenings after the crew had cleared out and sat at the table with his coffee and talked. About the ranch, about Clara, about things he was uncertain about, which took her a while to understand was a significant offering from a man who was used to being the person who had answers. He did not talk about Margaret often, but when he did, he talked about her honestly, without the careful editing that grief sometimes produces. He talked about who she actually was, including the ways she'd been difficult, and the ways he'd been difficult, and the ways they'd figured out how to be married to each other over 12 years of cattle and weather and a daughter and loss. Maeve told him about Daniel, not all at once. In the same piecemeal way Clara had talked about her mother, little irregular offerings, handed over when they felt right. She told him about the bakery, which she still missed in a way that surprised her sometimes. She told him about the fire, which she didn't like talking about, but could now do without the particular tightness she'd carried all summer. She told him about the 4 months between March and July, when she'd been trying to hold together something that was already gone, and how it had taken her longer than it should have to admit that sometimes the right thing is to stop trying to hold something together and figure out what to carry forward instead. "Is that what you did?" he asked. "Figured out what to carry forward?" "I'm still figuring it out," she said, "but I'm figuring it out here, which is better than where I was doing it before." He nodded. He understood about here. He'd built here. He'd almost lost here. The difference between almost losing something and keeping it is sometimes one person who arrives at the right moment with a carpet bag and $2.40 and a mother's recipe for pie crust pressed into muscle memory. He knew that now. He hadn't known it in July. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday afternoon in November, not in private but in front of the crew, which she hadn't expected and which was either the most romantic thing she could imagine or the most terrifying. She hadn't fully decided. The men were at the table after the noon meal, the big Sunday meal, the one with the pies. And Gideon stood up from his seat, and there was something in how he stood that made the table go quiet without anyone deciding to make it quiet. He looked at Maeve and he said simply, "I'd like you to become my wife and the mistress of this ranch, if you'll have me." The cookhouse was so quiet she could hear the fire. Clara, at her end of the table, was looking at her with the careful, neutral expression of a child who has decided not to influence something by wanting it too visibly. Evelyn, who was there because she'd started coming to Sunday dinners with a regularity that nobody had commented on, was looking at the tablecloth. The crew, 40 men, some of whom had pushed their bowls 2 inches away on a Monday evening in July and hadn't fully forgiven themselves for it, were looking at her with the collective expression of people who have decided which answer they're hoping for, but understand it's not their decision. Maeve set down the knife she'd been using to cut pie. She thought about July. She thought about the road into this property and the carpet bag and the feeling of standing at the stove with a ladle in her hand watching 40 plates go untouched. She thought about the orchard in the dark and the 11 pies and the specific smell of peach and wood smoke at 4 in the morning when you're operating on nothing but will. She thought about the photograph she still hadn't looked at, which meant she hadn't stopped loving Daniel, just learned that loving a person who is gone doesn't require you to remain in the past with them. She looked at Gideon, at his steady, honest face, at the man who had handed her 4 lines in a letter that leaned to the right like the wind had gotten into it, and who had kept his word when Evelyn tried to make him break it, and who had said nothing's changed through Walt when it mattered most, and who brought her a rolling pin because he noticed her had a wobble. "Yes," she said, for the second time in 3 months, still the right word, still simple. The table erupted. It was not dignified. Several men said things they probably shouldn't have at a table with a child present. Pete spilled his coffee again, this time a full cup, which hit the bench and soaked 3 inches of Holt's pant leg. Holt said something pointed in return. Clara laughed. Actually laughed. The real laugh. The unguarded one. And it was the best sound the cookhouse had heard since Maeve arrived. Evelyn smiled. It was a small smile. A private one. She was looking at the tablecloth, still, but the smile was real. Gideon, to his credit, looked more relieved than triumphant, which was the appropriate response. They were married in December, quietly, with Walt as witness, and Clara as the only other person present, which was how they both wanted it. Maeve wore her better dress, the one without the worn elbows, which she'd had repaired in October for reasons she hadn't examined at the time. Gideon wore a coat she'd never seen before, which was new, which meant he'd thought about it. She kept the cookhouse. This was not a negotiation or a concession. It was simply understood between them from the beginning. She was the mistress of Iron Ridge Ranch, and she was also the woman who showed up at 4:30 in the morning to start the fire. And there was no version of her life in which those two things were separate. The crew never treated them as separate. They'd understood since July that the cookhouse was the center of Iron Ridge, and the woman in it was the reason. What changed was the thing under the surface. The thing you can't see but you can feel when you walk into a place. That particular quality of a house that knows what it is. Gideon had said Howard Beale said it, a ranch that knows what it is. It hadn't known that in July. Or maybe it had known it once and lost it somewhere in the years between Margaret's death and Maeve's arrival. The way places sometimes lose themselves when the people who define them are gone. Maeve didn't replace Margaret. She knew that, and the people who loved Margaret knew that, and there was no pretending otherwise, nor any need to. What she did was something different. She walked into a place that had forgotten how to be itself, and she showed it through the daily repetition of meals made with attention and a cookhouse run with intention and a table that had room for everyone, what it had once been capable of being. And then she stayed, which is sometimes the harder part. The peach orchard got attention in the spring. Gideon had it properly pruned for the first time in what looked like a decade. Dead wood cleared, shape restored, the soil turned and fed. Clara took a proprietary interest in the project and spent 3 Saturdays in April working alongside the two men tasked with the pruning, asking questions with the thoroughness she brought to everything. By May, it was clear the orchard was going to produce well. Clara asked Maeve in May, out of nowhere, in the middle of a Tuesday morning, "Are you going to teach me all the pies?" "Eventually," Maeve said. "You have to get the biscuits down first." "My biscuits are fine," Clara said. "Your biscuits are getting there," Maeve said. "There's a difference." Clara accepted this with the dignity of someone who knows the gap between fine and there is worth closing. In June of the following year, Roy from Pemberton came by with his cousin Archie and two other men, and they sat at the table and ate. And afterward, Roy said, "You know, the story about this place has gotten around some." He said it in the careful tone of someone delivering news they think might be sensitive. "People talk about the cook at Iron Ridge and the pies. Some man at the trading post last week said he'd heard about a widow who came here with nothing and turned the whole place around." Maeve looked at him. "What did you tell him?" Roy considered. "I said the widow part was true, and the turning it around part was true, but the nothing part wasn't quite right." He picked up his coffee. "I said she came with plenty. She just kept most of it in her hands and her head, and wasn't going to show it to anyone who hadn't earned the right to see it." Maeve was quiet for a moment. "That's a good way to put it," she said. She thought about that for a long time afterward, about what it means to arrive somewhere with nothing that shows, about how the things that genuinely matter, the knowledge in your hands, the recipes in your muscle memory, the particular stubbornness that makes you light the stove again at midnight instead of packing the carpet bag, don't have a way to be seen from the outside. You can't declare them. You can only use them. And using them, day after day, meal after meal, is the only proof they exist. She'd come to Iron Ridge with $2.40 and a tin of recipe cards, and a grief she was still working through, and the absolute conviction that she was capable of doing the job if someone would give her the chance. That was the whole inventory. That was everything she'd had. It turned out to be enough. Not because it was impressive from the outside, because she'd refused to let it be less than what it was. That's the thing nobody tells you about starting over. Starting over is not a fresh page. It's carrying everything you already know into a room full of people who don't know you yet, and doing good work in front of them long enough that they stop seeing a stranger and start seeing someone they'd miss. It takes longer than you want it to, costs more than you expect. And some mornings you'll stand at the stove before dawn and wonder whether the cost is worth it, because the cost is real, and some days the return is not visible yet. But then a man rides 9 miles on a Sunday morning for a slice of pie. And it's not really about the pie. It's about the fact that someone in this world is doing something so well and so honestly that it's worth 9 miles of your time to go be near it. That's what Maeve had built. Not a reputation, not a legend, just a table that meant something, tended every day by someone who understood that the way you do the small things is exactly the same as the way you do the large ones, and there's no version of yourself you get to save for special occasions. You are the same person at 4:30 in the morning with flour on your hands as you are when the contract letter arrives. The only question is whether that person is worth showing up as. Maeve Callahan. Maeve Ashcroft, after December, showed up every morning for the rest of the years at Iron Ridge. She showed up when it was hard, and when it wasn't, and when she was tired, and when she was glad, and when the winter was long and the supplies were short, and when the summer was generous and the orchard was heavy with fruit. She showed up because she'd learned, in a fire in March, on a road in July, at a stove at midnight with 40 untouched plates behind her and nothing ahead of her but the decision she was about to make, that showing up is not the least you can do. It is most of the time everything.